I suppose if this is a testimony, I should introduce myself first. I'm Thomas Acton. I ran the first Gypsy Council caravan summer school in a caravan belonging to Grattan Puxon, the Secretary of the Gypsy Council, on an illegal campsite in East London in Hornchurch Airdrome, a disused airdrome, in 1967. And that was a life-changing experience for me. In 1967, I was only 18. And I went on to do a doctorate on British Gypsy politics and ended up 43 years later as Emeritus Professor of Romani Studies. And I just draw your attention to one thing about my first slide here, my title slide. If you can see up on the, get this up. If you can see up on the right-hand side here, there is a dim shadow. Can you see of a head? This is a detail from one of Daniel Baker's mirror paintings, and the head is the shadow of the person who took the photo of it. In fact, it's the head of Daniel himself. And possibly this must be the most reticent and self-effacing self-portrait in the history of art. And that is not entirely accidental. I shall come back to that, so I just want you to remember that. The other thing I'd say is, yes, I mean, I am a professor. I'm an elderly white man. I often lose myself while I'm lecturing and say things which are completely incomprehensible. And I'm also quite arrogant. And therefore, if you want to interrupt, do. If you've got a question, if you don't understand something I say, it's probably not because you're stupid, it's because I'm not communicating properly. So be brave enough to ask a question and say, I didn't understand that, and at least half the rest of the audience will be thankful. And if I'm responding to a question, at least I know I'm saying something that you want to hear, something that you've asked for. So you don't even have to keep the questions till the end. I'll try and leave room for questions. But if you get boiling with anger, just tell me. Right. And this lecture is really quite elementary. Having looked at the presentations we've had so far, going to such detail and such depth on particular aspects, and this isn't like that, this lecture. This is kind of a run-over of the preliminaries, a run-over of what I hope are the obvious stuff, and it stopped short, as it were, before the first Roma Pavillion at the Biennale 4 years ago. And I suppose it's my testimony as a non-artist, somebody who really finds the artist as a bit like rock stars, incredibly glamorous and slightly unbelieving that my academic work has allowed me to hang out with them and ask these questions. Okay, what do we mean by bearing witness? What do we mean by representation? And the first point that everybody makes is that if we look over the 500-600 years of well-documented Romani history in Europe and Western Europe particularly, there is a lot of writing, pictures and music related to Roma, but all of it got put on paper at least up until 1800 by Gage, by non-gypsies, by buffers, flatties, whatever. And simplifying wildly, they tend to represent Romani art as folk art. And it's only in the 20th century, really, do we find, maybe right at the end of the 19th century, but particularly in the 20th century, we begin to find individual creative Romani gypsy traveller writers and artists making representations and then often being criticised by the garge, by the art world, as not being typical. And of course, I mean, in a sense, the professional artist isn't typical of human beings in general. It's the same way that traveller politicians aren't typical, as the United Nations Development Project points out, as if garage politicians were representative. It says that it found that only, I think it was the UNDP study in 2002 found that only something like a third of Roma that they surveyed had any confidence in Romani politicians to represent them. Just think if you asked Garget that, ordinary English people, French people, how many of you have confidence in politicians to represent you? I don't think you'd get anything like 37%. But if you don't make the comparison like with like, then the fact that politicians and artists are always pretty untypical anyway, or are they? Maybe one of the things that we've seen today is the striving of artists not to be typical, but to, in challenging stereotypes, present new typifications of their experience. But really, up until the 1990s, particularly in visual arts, but across art in general, we've got a contrast between art for art's sake, the romantic artists, something done by Europeans, and this collective, traditional, repetitive thing called folklore or naive art. And why does that happen? Who makes the representation? Who makes the rules? And to answer that, we need a kind of general theory of art and culture. My God. In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to give you a general theory of art and culture, so you don't really need to listen to somebody who's got a doctorate in it. I specialise in simplification. What are the social functions of art? Why do some ethnic groups at certain times seem to make a classic contribution to world culture, overleaping boundaries of time, place, and culture? And when my dad is a pianist, he's just given up teaching piano at the age of 90. Going deaf didn't stop him, but going blind is. But for him, music starts with Mozart. The Brandenburg concertos are an early precursor of music. It ends with Bach. So Tchaikovsky's doing a very good imitation of music. But really, basically, it's a number of German and Austrian musicians from the late 18th century to the late 19th century. And that's it. Why does he have that curious view of music, which, if you think about it logically, why should music just have happened in German-speaking regions between 1790 and 1890s? But when people like me were young, that's what people meant by classical music. So why do some, I mean, all music is folk music, as Louis Armstrong said when somebody asked him, is jazz really folk music? He said, I never heard horses playing it. To me, as a sociologist, the question of whether Keats is better than Dylan or Dylan better than Keats is absolutely meaningless. I'm not going to tell you anything about the quality of art. What I'm interested in is what it says. And everybody does art. There's art relating to every society that's ever been. But why do the arts of some societies seem to grab people from other societies? That's the question. And the answer, I think, is, or the obvious one, we have to take account of the history of the development of any symbol system and the social context of the current uses of the symbol system, and that is not an original insight particularly, as you know. Now, where can we start? And well, the way I had to start with my students when I'm trying to teach that is to compare the study of Romani, Gypsy and Traveller visual arts with the study of Romani, Gypsy and Traveller music. And why this is helpful is because, in a sense, there's both a classical study of Romani, Gypsy, Traveller music going back well into the 19th century, and there's also a critique of it. And the reason why I'm going to take 5 minutes going over that is because I think it's maybe possible to borrow the critique of the classic European study of Gypsy music for the study of visual representation. All right, so next 5 minutes is just on music. And we know that the study of Romani and Gypsy Traveller music, the classical musicians tended to treat folk songs as though they were authorless object trouvé. In other words, folk songs were just there. They were written by that most prolific of singer-songwriters, anon, or songwriters, anon. In fact, the story I always love about the School of Scottish Studies and Hamish Henderson that we heard about was his first meeting with Belle Stewart. When he went and saw Belle Stewart and, sort of basically asked her where she'd been all his life and would she sing him some songs. It was really, and then he produced this song and he said, "Do you know this one, The Berry Fields of Blair?" And she said, "Yes, I wrote it." And he didn't believe her. And he only believed her when she was able to fish out the old recruiting bills for the berry picking that she'd written it on in pencil on the back of, and the date of those bills. And he could see that she'd written it before he'd ever collected it. Right? So for him, it had become part of this timeless canon. All right? And we get the nonsense of Ewan McCall's study of Belle Stewart. You know it? And he writes the nonsensical sentence that the canon of Gypsy Traveller folk song in Scotland is now complete and is dying with Belle Stewart. How could anybody write that about Belle Stewart? She was writing new songs up to the day that she lost her marbles. How could you take somebody who was an active singer-songwriter, who produced an original song which is perhaps one of the most iconic productions of Scottish Gypsy Traveller culture, and say, oh, this is a dead canon? Right? It takes a particular kind of blindness. And Ewan McCall, the star of the Communist Party folklore department, it's not that he was a man who thought he was trying to be racist or trying to be discriminatory. If that teaches us anything, it teaches that you can't decide not to be racist, because racism is a form of ignorance. You have to do a lot of hard work, a lot of study not to be racist. And even when you've decided, when you're doing that study, the old assumptions can come creeping back, as they did in Ewan McCall writing about Belle Stewart. However, if we look at those kinds of Gypsy Romani Traveller music, which clearly became professional music, performed by trained people for a paying audience, and they're making their living from it, we can find in Britain, we can find in Europe, 3 clear and distinct professional Romani music traditions. And I've listed those up here. That we've got the Middle Eastern and the Balkan traditions, and I get told off by calling that Muslim Romani music, and it's of course an enormous portmanteau because it contains many different variations, but they're variations which have got large elements of the same musical language. So I always remember visiting Orizari in Skopje, Macedonia in the 1970s, and all the Romani musicians would be down to the showing of Indian and Pakistani films on a Saturday morning in cinemas which were shown there, and they would be pinching the music, all right? So in that sense, you've got really over the whole area of the former Ottoman Empire, you've got a professional music area of which Roma were and are a very important part. Then you've got a different tradition, the northern tradition, and here again I'm summarizing wildly, and I'm putting in that so-called Hungarian gypsy music, the Russian gypsy music, and of course the Polish gypsy music from which the Russian gypsy music is things, and Manouche jazz. Django Reinhardt is that kind of music jazzed up. And then the third, which everybody is aware of, is flamenco music from the Iberian Peninsula. And those are professional music. How do they relate to other forms of music? Well, I want to get rid of the word folk music altogether, because I think that it's so implicated in the racist accounts of culture that we had from the 19th century. That I'm with Louis Armstrong, right? Only folk produce culture, so calling culture folk doesn't distinguish anything. So I'm going to go by social function, and I'm going to use the term domestic music, and I'm going to contrast it with professional music as to who its audience is and what it's for. Domestic music is music that you produce at home for yourself, and everybody has that kind of music. Apart from one guy I know at church who never sings and only listens to Radio 5 in Britain because he can't stand music. And he stands out in my mind because he's the only person I've ever met like that. Even I sing while I'm doing the washing up, at least until my children tell me to stop. What does somebody like me sing? I sing hymns, I sing the evangelical choruses I learned as a child. I sing all sorts of things. I sing for myself what I've heard. And everybody does that. And there's a relationship between domestic music and professional music. Professional music is always borrowing from street music, from music that people are producing from themselves. And of course, street music is always borrowing from the techniques and the panache of professional music. So there's a constant interaction between professional and domestic music. And once we look at that functional distinction, we can actually disinter some of the racist processes that's going on. Because if we look at Hungarian musicology of Romani, very important, Liszt, Bartók, and all of those, and they look at the so-called Ola Roma, the Lovari, who are singing, and they say, oh, these are the primitive Roma, those are the authentic thing. And they look at the Bashaldo Roma, they look at somebody like Rabbi Lakatos, or my former MA student Gabor Boros, and say, oh, that's just cafe music. It's not like the authentic music of the Lovari. And that's just a category mistake. Because the northern tradition in which that Bashaldo Hungarian music belongs is separated by 300 to 400 years of music and history from the Ottoman music, of which Lovari oral tradition is a domestic variant. So if you're going to look at the professional music to which Ola Roma music relates in Hungary, you have to look across the border to the Muslim world, to the ex-Ottoman world, to the Middle Eastern music. And you can see that that kind of music does in fact have a professional incarnation in other places. And to say, oh, the Ola music is authentic folk music, and the rabid lakatos, oh, that's just a modern perversion. So if I just bring it back to Scottish music again, Jeannie Robertson and Belle Stewart, which is your favourite? Belle Stewart, she says, I agree with you, because Jeannie Robertson, a fine singer, but professional, whereas Belle Stewart was commenting on her own time and place. Belle Stewart couldn't care less whether her music was traditional or not. She wanted to make it work for now. So yes, it's not fair to disparage the one and have the others, because of course they're brilliant. But if the one I'd walk through fire and water to listen to would be Belle Stewart. And then, of course, if we just do that, we're missing one of the dimensions, because the third dimension that I put here is religious music. And professional music, people are singing for a paying audience. Domestic music, they're singing for themselves or their family at home. Religious music, people are singing for God or for an ideal. So in some sense, yes, I think Mao's ballet, the Maoist ballet of the detachment of red women, I count that as religious music. And I speak as a Baptist there. So in a sense, communist propaganda, that for me is also religion and religious music. And I say that as a religious person, all right, and as a sociologist. And
does it mean that domestic music and religious music could be the same? If religious music is done in the family?
Oh yes, but if it's sung in the family, then it's domestic. Yeah. If it's sung for God. So I'm thinking of the director of music of the Via Lumia mission who I met in the 1970s, who used to play in the cafes, and then he gave up playing money for music altogether. He sold clothes in the market for 2 days a week, and 5 days a week he played music in church, because for him that was the sign of his conversion. From henceforward, he was only going to play music for God. And to look at some of the evangelical gypsy music, particularly in France, there you've got a basis of the Manouche jazz, coloured by East European versions, Northern East European rather than Southern, but the Russian gypsy music, a link with flamenco, a link with American soul, and a link with American gospel. So you've got an incredible fusion, so you've got a tremendous outburst of energy in Pentecostal gypsy music, particularly within the Romani directed churches, not so much in those which are run by Romanian or Hungarian or other non-gypsy pastors. And what you hear in the tent meetings is one thing. And then, this is where you get your point about the domestic. If you creep around to where the musicians from Spain and from France are jamming together, perhaps with a couple of American evangelists in their caravans after the service is finished, then you can hear wild stuff indeed. So here's my prediction that in fact the development of Pentecostal Romani music could be one of those moments, like plain song, like Beethoven and Mozart, one of those moments in world cultural history which will, afterwards, people will look back and say, wow, that was something new. Now, can we do the same for visual art? And, well, I'm trying to do this, and what I'm going to say is that as for literature and music, we can see how visual artists of all cultures constantly borrow themes, motifs, and tropes across cultural boundaries, but they do so to make sense of their own situations. And of course, if we look at Romani Gypsy traveller art, we can see two broad cultural matrices which provide the basis for contemporary RGT artists, Romani Gypsy traveller artists, to engage with an international art market. And those two, from Eastern Europe, the Renaissance neoclassicism transmitted via socialist realism and kind of married up with folklorism in Eastern Europe. And then the second is the one that we've seen in the past decade, the emergence of contemporary, with the new Romani art, which draws on contemporary West European modern art of the 20th century. There's a picture of the young Dr. Agnes de Zorzi in Budapest when she was a young lady. She worked in the Hungarian Culture Ministry, deliberately almost conspiring against the Hungarian Education Ministry to promote Romani culture, right? Through youth camps with Romani language and stuff, and through the promotion of exhibitions of what they then had to call naive art. And that's the 1989 catalogue. The word they use for naive is autodidact, self-taught. Right? Actually, some of them have been to art college. But if they were gypsies, they had to be self-taught. All right? It was a ghetto for Romani art, organised by the leading Romani apparatchik, who was a dissident and an opponent of the regime in many ways. It was a liberating self-assertion, but as I knew from discussing with Agnes de Zorzi at the time, it was divorced from politics. They were doing culture because that was allowed, but they weren't allowed to do politics. They could talk about the need to preserve the Romani language. They couldn't talk about the fact that that half the Hungarian miners were Roma in the 1970s and 80s, with huge accident rates, many more than in Western Europe. They couldn't talk about the income differentials. They couldn't talk about a whole load of other stuff, a divorce from politics. If we jump forward to the year 2000, we've lost the autodidact word, and in that catalogue, de Zorzi specifically says that stopping to use the word autodidact was only possible after the fall of communism. But we're still in Hungary in a world where people thought that cultural recognition substituted for human rights. And we're seeing that policy falling apart in Hungary at the moment. The national minority self-governments, without power, elected by amorphous electorates, a way of marginalising the Romani radicals. I jump forward again to Ferdinand Koch, who can't be here, and yeah, you can see that as an example. I think that's my favourite Ferdinand Koch painting, as an example of East European classicism appropriating the tone of state-sponsored naive art. And it's really, if you've ever visited the Horahane Roma in Skopje and so forth, this lady, what she's doing is she's giving the plates and cups a wash immediately before the meal. Right? You wash up after the meal and then you wash the plates again before the meal. So when you get to that stage, you know that within about 10 minutes, something really scrumptious is going to appear. And it's just caught that moment. And I've seen that, and I can feel myself hungry just looking at her. It's just, and it's that domestic moment which he has recycled for a professional audience. Although it's one of the paintings, I don't know whether he's sold it yet, but it's one of the ones that turns up at all his exhibitions. But if I had the money, that's the one I'd buy. Now, let's contrast that with modern, and one image from Delaine Labat called Four Facts of Life, Mixed Media on Fabric. And it's got a number of Delaine Labat motifs, the skull and crossbones, the nuclear danger, the hunting, the idea that the countryside where gypsies are supposed to live is not an idyllic place, it's a place of danger, oppression. It's subverting the Union Jack symbol. It's quite radical as outsider art. And let's carry this on a bit. say something about both. I mean, both of these traditions, if you like, are overtly resisting being patronized as naive, right? Naive or autodidactic. So one of the characteristics of the contemporary Romani art is that it rejects that characterization. It's not folklore. It's the product of artists. Does that mean it's all original? Well, if it was all original, we wouldn't understand it. Artists rearrange symbols from other people's experience to say something new. Although the ones which get across best is when the artist presents something which people say, that's what we knew all along. So in fact, popular artists are the ones who play to their audience's prejudices, aren't they? Prophetic artists are the ones that get recognised long after they're dead. The rhetoric of both modern art and socialist realism is liberation. How liberated can it be? Delane and Damien Labar were feted in British radical art magazines as the king and queen of outsider art. And there they are. There's a picture from, I don't know, I suppose about 20 years ago. Pardon? Yeah, about that, yeah. And with one of Damien's pictures behind. I mean, when I first met them, they looked rather like that, a little bit older, and I went to an exhibition up in North London of outsider art, and a couple, and they struck me as terribly arty. Delane was born to a caravan-dwelling family in the New Forest, and travelled all over Oxford, the northeast, and so forth. Her father eventually found the money to buy his own land, and he now lives in caravans on his own land where he can work. She was always dead set on going to art school, and she insisted, and her father gave in. She said it was very embarrassing. She was the only student at her art school whose father dropped them off right outside the door 5 minutes before her first lecture, and was waiting in the road with the engine running 5 minutes before the end of her last lecture in a day. All right? He really did not want her hanging around with all those gorgeous. He was actually, he and her mother were quite pleased when they told her she'd met another artist who was a traveller, Damien, who, despite a French name, Labar is from an Irish traveller family. That lasted right up until she brought him home and they realised he was an Irish traveller. But a very personable Irish. There's a kind of, for those of you who are not aware of this, Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities are not necessarily immune to ethnic prejudice against other Roma Gypsy traveller prejudices. Both Damien and Delane, Delane is one of the most determined people I know, and Damien is also very personable, and they just stick it out. And Damien now regularly goes scrap collecting with his father, as does their son, young Damien, who about 3 or 4 years ago got a first-class honours degree in theology at Oxford, while still going scrap collecting with illiterate cousins, even while he was at university. And why I love Delane is because when I went to interview her for a book which, I've got it on the stall over there, she brought out a little children's book that I produced in 1971, and it was all torn, and some of it had been coloured in, and she said, "Are you the Thomas Acton that wrote this?" And I said, oh yes. And she said, "I've had this since I was 9 years old. It was used with us in one of the school traveller projects, and it's one of the reasons why I became an artist. So as far as I'm concerned, she can do no wrong. Are the socialist artists, I mean, I suppose what I am suggesting before is that the modern gypsy artists, if you're going to try and put them down, could they be just kind of like court jesters, people doing funny stuff to get attention? Are the socialist artists in the tradition of court painters producing realism? Leave the answer. That's just a picture of Ferdinand Colci, another self-portrait. He's drawing himself as a young man in his village, drawing ladies from his village to present them with the drawings. And if you want kind of artist biographies, we've got them. I've got the catalogue of the 2006 exhibition that we organised at Greenwich. And I better hurry on. How did we put together? Well, this is where I really got lucky, because I don't really have a visual sense. I already explained that. One picture is as good as another to me. If I can understand it, I'm looking for the meaning more than the style. And but being a professor of Romani studies, I got put on the committee for the 2006 London Romani Film Festival. And there were all these people talking about films, some of which I'd seen and some of which I hadn't. And I'm not an expert on films either, you know, so I thought, is there something else I could do? And I thought, well, Daniel was my MA student at Greenwich. Delane and Damien were like rock stars to me. Ferdinand I'd met when he came over from Albania with his Australian Romani wife, Tracy Smith. And I'd admired them separately, and I thought, well, you know, maybe this is an opportunity that will let me just bring an exhibition of these four individuals whom I admire separately and put them together. And what I was concerned with, that this wouldn't be an exhibition about gypsies. This was an exhibition of artists who'd made their way in the world without trading on the ethnic card in any way. Right? They'd been to college like other people, they'd sold artwork like other people, they had reputations amongst an art world that weren't concerned whether they were Romani or not. Not that any of them had ever, all four of those individuals have been very clear about their ethnic identity publicly. All right. Ferdinand was the first Romani student in the art faculty at the University of Tirana ever. But they were artists, and the brief to them was that they should, you know, they were not putting together an exhibition about gypsies, that they were putting together an exhibition of whatever they thought was most important about their work. What perhaps took me by surprise is that when they were working together, the common experience of prejudice against their families was overwhelming. So in a sense, history broke in. The commonality of their experience meant that even though their styles and traditions and artistic origins were so difficult, there's a common origin. There's the catalogue that I just put up. And what followed, and that's how we got that exhibition together. And if I have credit for, I mean, you know, the artists themselves took over, and I have a daughter who's an art organizer and now a project coordinator, like all the people you see with project coordinator written on their buttons here. Well, she's one of those, but in England. And without her, and without the fact that the artists were so kind to me, I would have been nowhere. So as a curator, I'm an absolute fraud. But it was a brilliant exhibition, and what followed, well, these are the four things. This is the end of the history: engagement with local school children and community organisations, an Arts Council grant to tour the exhibition round England. So we went to Appleby Fair, we went to the east of England, and We went to Leeds. A precedent for the organisation of the first Gypsy, Roma and Traveller History Month, right? They drew on our experience working with children in this exhibition to form the form of how History Month worked. And an inspiration, Timea Younghouse rang me up and put stuff into, first of all, the OSI journal, and then I'm very proud that of our 4 artists in that exhibition, 3 of them were amongst the, how many artists, 17, 19 artists at the first Biennale, and material from that came into that. So it was a seedbed for that, and just some images there. There's Daniel discussing his work with school children. There's school children sitting on the floor producing artwork. All right? I just couldn't miss that one. There's Delaine Labar, taken by her husband Damien, looking through a window at Abbots Hall in East Anglia at one of her own soft sculptures. And, you know, does it say something about relating to your own situation? I think so. Ferdinand Kochi conducting a workshop in Leeds, right? These were typical. This is what's going on. There will be stuff like this going on at Appleby Fair from today in England. Stuff going on all throughout June in various local areas where they're getting artists, they're getting travellers in for folk stories, this kind of cultural engagement. Now, is there a message to this? Well, I don't know. The art tells us that culture is always changing. The human spirit is irrepressible. We can still refuse to be tied down, right? And the presentations in this Biennale have told us that. It told us about France in the 1950s, what Rosanna and Seamus have just told us about Scotland right now. It sounds depressing in some sense, a catalogue of failure. But I always remember what Grattan Pugson said to me in the 1960s. He said, always have at least 5 battles on the go at once, because you're going to lose 4 of them. But if you win one, that will keep you going. We can back, I say, the people traffickers against the nation state. There's some thing, you know, we've got Baroness Ashton and all of these people saying people trafficking is the dangerous thing facing Europe. I say rubbish. I'm not, you know, I'm against prostitution, I'm against slavery, I'm against exploitation, but it doesn't make any difference if they're just because people move from one country to another. What the Stop the Traffic people, the anti-trafficking people have done is they've managed to hijack the oppression of Gypsy, Roma, Traveller people, which we've heard about today, and turn it into an instrument of anti-traveller politics, of anti-migrant politics. So the crime becomes not the prostitution, the slavery or the exploitation. That's fine, so long as it happens back home. You know, we catch women who've been trafficked into prostitution, we set them free, and then ship them back to Slovakia where somebody prostitutes them again. All right? I know people, I have friends whose lives have been saved by people traffickers. I don't know anybody whose life has been saved or who's been helped in any way by an immigration official. Art can cut through the bullshit, maybe. We can assert that intellectual property is a theft of God's free grace. You know, if we look at the whole folklore thing, what the capitalists create is copyright. But then when they went collecting folk music, everything that they collected and expropriated from the singers was trad. And I say, in the end, what matters is the message, not the messengers. In the end, the ethnicity of the artists in this exhibition is unimportant. For centuries, Roma, Gypsies and Travellers have been only the passive objects of representation. But in the past few years, this emergence of a new Romani art has identified the missing subject and invited it to step forward. And this is where Daniel's mirror paintings come in, right? And what Daniel said, and I'm hoping to read his PhD thesis because, but what he discussed particularly in 2006 is the omission of the human subject from traditional Romani arts and crafts. And in his mirror paintings, he had a kind of a series of variations on traditional motifs. But it's impossible to take a photograph of one of Daniel's mirror pieces without catching your own reflection in it. All right? So every photograph of one of Daniel's mirror pieces is kind of like a fresh work of art. It's a personal work of art. If you take a picture yourself, it's almost as though Daniel had dedicated that work of art to you because you're in it. All right? It's a wonderful metaphor of the emergence of the human subject. All right? But to do this, and again, as we've seen, and I pay tribute to this exhibition, the concreteness of history well, particularly of Rosanna and yesterday Tom McDonough's papers in the detailed history, right? And there is no substitute for that. Broad generalizations. We need the real documentation. That's why Romani revisionist history is so important. I mean, in a broad sense, my 2-minute summary, having just said we need the details, here's my 2-minute history of Roma in Europe. It's a tale of two genocides. The genocides of the 16th century, along with the enslavements which Roma survived and created what Europeans thought of as the Romani or traveller way of life, which is how they survived those earlier genocides. And then in the 20th century, the Nazi Holocaust and the drive into ghettos and caravan sites, which made the way of survival that people had survived in the 17th century impossible again. And that leads to the new gypsy politics. And of course, in the same way, it leads to the new gypsy art. And we are still writing that narrative. And to write that narrative, we have to rewrite. We have to recognize. We have to look again at those earlier genocides. We have to realize, we have to put Roma back into European history. Otherwise, Europeans will go on smug in their racist ignorance. So, the story of how Roma art has suddenly, over the last 10 years, burst on the international scene, and its presence at the Venice Biennale is untellable unless we also reshape the historical narrative of the marginalization, brutalization, intermittent genocide and exclusion of Roma from European history. And I just finish with, this is my favorite drawing by Ferdinand Cocci. And it's kind of the ultimate ironic use of stereotype. You've got every stereotype that is in there, right? You've got the dancing bear. Can you see the dancing bear? The dancing lady right next to her. The long dog, the caravan, and the kind of gloomy god, and the stop sign. You can't quite see as much detail, or I don't know, at the screen. And I mean, Ferdinand is a Muslim, and yet he's got this Christian Jesus and the allusions to the famous internalization of racial stereotyping, the legend of the fourth nail of the cross in there. He's put the lot in there, and the title followed by God. And in a sense, if you can deconstruct that wonderful image fully, then you've perhaps realized some of what the new Romani art is about, whether it comes from a modernist background or whether it comes from a socialist realist background. There it is, and that's all I've got to say.